Police have raided EU Parliament offices, allegedly looking for signs of Russian interference. Is this part of Putin's strategy? And what else is he doing on this global chessboard? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this I thought was one of the most interesting stories that I came across today. And this is coming to us from Political Wire, that police in Belgium, according to Politico, raided EU parliamentary offices. This is part of the what Europeans are calling their Russiagate probe, which is incredibly annoying because it's not really connected to the U.S. Russiagate involving former President Donald Trump, or at the time he was currently the president. But this is an investigation claiming that members of the European Parliament were paid to promote Russian talking points via the Voice of Europe website, right? Voice of Europe being a shell company or a shell entity used to promote pro-Russian propaganda. And I thought this was interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, you go to the Voice of Europe website, and now that it is busted, so to speak, you can see that there's a bunch of salacious stories here, right? Including them being like, join our Telegram. The European authorities are hiding the truth about the real situation in Europe, right? And I think this is really an interesting kind of site because it contains what look like real stories, along with sort of RT style spin, right? This is something that Russia has done for a long time in the United States with RT, where they take real stories presented with a Russian spin, they amplify fake stories, and will just simply report simple stories, right? You can see here why Rishi Sunak will lose. And you also have that you can see anti-Ukrainian refugee stories, right? About Ireland cutting pensions and disability payments for some Ukrainian refugees, right? You notice, though, it's saying to Ireland readers, hey, those Ukrainian refugees, they are stealing your benefits, right? A classic one. Another one, of course, crime surge expected during Paris Olympics, right? So this is very, very pro-Russian propaganda, right? Creating spinning an isolationist narrative for Europe. Again, this idea that Europe doesn't have the resources to help its own people, that those resources are being siphoned off by aid to Ukraine, which again, when we've looked at the data here on this channel, we know that's not really grounded in reality, but that is for a different video. The important thing is that promoting these talking points, right, via this Voice of Europe website, that should also tell you, did that look like a website to you guys that had the funds and resources to buy members of parliament, right? Did that look like that looked like a website that you and I could put together in a couple of days, right? Especially with some AI, reposting old stories. It'd be pretty easy to do, right? And it looks like a fly-by-night website with low viewership and no ads that I could see. So then how do they get the money to bribe entire members of European Parliament, or promote Russian talking points? So this is really interesting. In fact, two people, the allegation is that these actual raids were conducted at private residence in Brussels and linked European Parliament officers in Strasbourg and Brussels. And there are one investigator said, quote, there are indications that the European Parliament employee concerned played a significant role in this operation. So that's sort of code for, we think this may be someone who is acting as a Russian agent. And we know Russian agents have pervaded Europe lately, engaging in not just these kind of political intrigues, but also explicit cases of sabotage. According to two people familiar with the investigation, Belgian police are actually looking at the connection specifically of a parliamentary assistant who has a really interesting career. He worked for the far-right Alternative for Germany, right? And then worked for a far-right Dutch member of European Parliament, Marcel de Graaf. De Graaf, of course, not responding to a comment, but it's also found that the AFD scandal laden including, get this, that they were also an employee of the Chinese Secret Service. So really interesting to see, because we've heard explicitly that Russia and China are engaged in a level of cooperation economically. But this is the first time I've seen indications that Chinese intelligence and Russian intelligence are working closely together to align their interests within the European parliamentary system. Really interesting, because again, you have something where these two countries don't seem to have interests that are explicitly aligned, but both China and Russia want to see a pivot away from Russia, or to ensure that, that Europe remains or Western Europe really, or the EU remains kind of an isolationist political actor, right? What they want to do is, in both cases, I think, have the Europeans close themselves off to the global community, because within that sort of closed off space, right, a less engaged internationally EU, they are going to allow countries like Russia and China to fill that gap, literally, right? And again, look at how it would work with Russia, where they say, listen, if you convince everyone in the EU or large swaths of voters that actually their country is taking resources that should go to its citizens and giving them to countries like Ukraine, and that citizens are worse off as a result, then Russia is going to literally expand its power base by expanding into Ukraine. China has a similar relationship to Taiwan, right? It has a fraught human rights record. It has a lot of designs on kind of the South China Sea, and it relies on selling goods to Europe to fuel its sort of unstable economy, right? Its faltering economy. That's the word I want. And for China, the idea that the EU could be another pole, right? Because you have the United States, you have Europe, which are two huge economies that share kind of liberal values. And then on the other side of the world, you have kind of Russia and China as two large autocratic countries. And so they're trying to create a world where, while European economies need to be big, right, so China and Russia can sell goods to them, they have to behave like a country that doesn't have any international power and prestige. And so I think that's why you see both of them working together, even though, again, China, a communist country, and Russia, an ultra-nationalist dictatorship, working together to try to keep Europeans isolated from the international community. And so this is a really, really troubling turn of events, and also sort of comical, again, given that China is out here supporting far-right European parties when, again, they're ostensibly communist. Like, there are actual European communist parties. And the fact that China, the largest communist state in the world, doesn't support them tells you basically everything you need to know about China. Now, that's not the only piece that Putin seems to be moving on his chessboard, Putin and Xi. But before we talk about the next component, I wanted to mention that if you're looking for a boost, you don't need to corrupt a European far-right party. Instead, you could just check out some Strike Gum, right? Zero sugar, just 15 calories per piece. 90 milligrams of caffeine and 100 milligrams of alpha GPC in every single piece, right? That is as much caffeine as a Red Bull or an Amp Energy, plus the alpha GPC for additional cognitive boost. It's made here in the USA. You can get it at strikegum.com, or you can get it on Amazon. We just rolled out our 5-pack, right? So this way, if you're looking to try it, you don't have to pay to ship just 1 pack of gum. But if you want to try it, you should. And if you're like, hey, I don't want to commit, I don't know if I'm going to like it enough to get this, the larger tray, the 5-pack is perfect. And so you can get it on strikegum.com. That's where we have the veteran discounts and first-time customer discounts. But you can also get it on Amazon. Just go to Amazon, search Strike Gum or Strike Gum Energy, and you'll see the 5-pack right there. And a huge thank you to all the people who have left us 5-star reviews, particularly on the 5-pack, since it just came out. Because, as you guys know, a lot of the stuff on Amazon, it's white label, it's made overseas, it has, it's often dehydrated. The quality just isn't there. And that's why Strike Gum is made here in the USA, right? Using just premium ingredients, never dehydrated, natural caffeine. It's a lot more expensive, but when you chew it, you can taste it. It makes a real difference. And again, because it's made in the US, I know that it's safe. I can literally visit the factory down at Liquid Core in Denver. They're great guys that work there. So it's a totally different world than the other caffeinated energy gum brands. So thanks to you guys that helped get the word out about Strike Gum. Okay, so let's talk about this other story. And this only got just a little two-liner, but I thought it was really significant. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has signed into law suspending the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, according to a document posted to the government's legal website today. And here's what's interesting. What is the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe? Well, it's an arms control treaty. Bear in mind, this is a Google AI overview, but this sounds right. And the sources they cite are real. There's no like Reddit. So it's not going to tell you that to put Elmer's glue on your pizza, right? The Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces is a legally binding agreement from the 90s, but its goal is to establish a military balance between at the time the Soviet Union, Soviet-aligned countries, and NATO by limiting the amount of conventional weaponry that each could deploy. Right, limited tanks, armored combat vehicles, heavy artillery, combat aircraft, and attack helicopters. You can also see how this treaty in the 90s would likely be a core concept that drove kind of the ultra high-tech investment into these kind of weapon systems, right? Where now we're seeing that, in fact, a cheap tank is preferred to a very expensive one because, again, we see with Russia, when you have high losses, it's cheaper to replace a simple designed Soviet-style tank or infantry fighting vehicle than it is to replace like an ultra-advanced, like a top-of-the-line Abrams. Right? But if you are limited in how many of each you can have, then you have an incentive to make very, very, very high-tech versions of each. Now, the treaty, right, capped these numbers, but in December 2023, U.S. and other NATO allies suspended their participation in the treaty in response to Russia's withdrawal from the pact and other factors, right? Like the other factors were Russia's war in Ukraine. And Russia, of course, never really complied with the treaty since 2007, given that it never really, turns out, destroyed most of its stocks of tanks. As we know, Russia has been massively refurbishing all of its Soviet stocks, something that it was supposed to never have had in the first place. And so, again, it's another case study in like the West misjudging Putin as being an honest actor when in fact he is a self-interested one and one that simply treats Putin seems to operate as though all international countries just lie through their teeth, right? And that's just not the case, right? EU countries actually do what they say they're going to do, by and large. But the fact that Belarus is also withdrawing from this treaty indicates to me that there might be a little bit more going on than we think, right? One, it could signal that Belarus is preparing to actually become a boots on the ground participant in the Ukraine conflict by actually expanding its armed forces and then deploying them. But what I think is much more likely is that Putin is saying, listen, I need my allies to help manufacture and refurbish these weapons so that I can purchase them from them. Because again, as we know, Russia's relying a lot on refurbishment and not as much on manufacture of its heavy military equipment. So if it can go to someone like Lukashenko and say, listen, we will buy every artillery piece you can make. We will buy every BMP that you can refurbish. Or more accurately, they may be buying parts. But they want to sit there and say, listen, if you want Belarus to manufacture a bunch of new artillery pieces or purchase them, right? Ostensibly, they're going to be purchased and enter the European or the Belarusian armed forces before they're transferred to Russia. So Belarus needs to leave this treaty in order to legally begin to expand its military. Now, the fact that this happened, right? Some people may see it as perfunctory, but you should note that it is a sign of escalating involvement by Belarus in the Ukraine conflict. Anyway, guys, that's all I had for you. Thanks to our Colonel tier members of Combat Vet News. Thanks to our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys, and I will see you all in the next one. Cheers.